America was at war again. But the images being beamed live into living rooms across the country were different than ever before. High-tech missiles flared across the night sky. Airplanes that looked like rockets flew sorties over bizarre landscapes, and yes, that soldier in desert fatigues carrying an M16 was a woman. For many Americans, this was the first time they had any realization that sisters, daughters, wives, and even mothers were in service to America. In fact, today nearly 13% of our armed forces are women. And though it may seem surprising to some, women have served their country, fought, been injured, and died in every war and conflict since America was born. In the Revolutionary War, women were a frequent sight in the middle of the battlefields. They carried water to the weary soldiers and tended their wounds. Legends have made famous the name of Molly Pitcher, though no one is sure who the real Molly was. There may have been hundreds of women who followed their husbands to aid in the fight for independence. The Daughters of the American Revolution has recognized Margaret Corbin as one such woman, who took over her fallen husband's cannon at the Battle of Fort Washington in 1776. Some women, however, wanted to join directly in the fighting. It was forbidden by the Army.
There were so many more women who participated in the military in the 19th century than anyone would really believe. There was at least one woman who fought as a soldier in the Revolution that we know of. She was passing herself off as a man. Her name was Deborah Sampson. She served about 2 years in a Massachusetts regiment before they found out that Robert was a woman and sent her home.
During the early days of our history, there was no prospect for a woman to even be directly associated with the military except as a civilian, unless she disguised herself as a man. Every war we've ever had, there's been that concern on the part of women to do something for the war effort.
The War of 1812 was no exception, but it was during the war between the states that the role of women became truly critical to the war effort on both sides.
Women were participants in the Civil War on a very large scale. They were nurses, they were spies, they ran businesses, they ran farms. They were very actively involved in the war, and some women took the war so seriously that they wanted to fight. They wanted to be soldiers, and the only way they could do it was to disguise themselves as men and enlist using male names, male disguises, cutting their hair short, padding the waists of their trousers, trying to wear big overcoats to hide their form. And it's surprising how many got away with it for years.
The stories are numerous. John Evans was discovered as Mary Evans when she was wounded after serving 18 months. Loretta Velasquez fought at Bull Run as Lieutenant Harry Buford. And while public regard for these women was high after the war, the Army tried to deny that women played a role. Even when renowned journalist Ida Tarbell of the American Magazine inquired at the turn of the century about women in the Civil War, the War Department claimed no record existed of any women serving. In truth, soldiers such as Sarah Edmonds were definitely of record in the official files. Sarah, who served as Franklin Thompson in the Union Army, deserted because she feared discovery after contracting malaria. However, in 1886, her service was acknowledged and she received a pension. Albert Cashier distinguished himself in the 95th Illinois Infantry and received a pension. Albert was discovered to be a female in 1913, the year before she died. Only in the medical corps were women allowed to serve as themselves, and many are known as significant figures today. Clara Barton ministered to the wounded and dying and eventually established the American Red Cross. Dr. Mary Walker gave up her medical practice to serve initially as a nurse because female doctors were not accepted in the Union Army. After being taken prisoner and subsequently exchanged, Dr. Walker was finally commissioned and became the first woman doctor in the Army. She was awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor, but it was withdrawn in 1917. It took a special act of Congress in 1976 to restore Dr. Walker's award. Dorothea Dix was appointed to actually recruit nurses for the Union Army. In the beginning, her regulations were to serve as a nurse, a woman had to be over 30, plain-looking, and wear plain brown or black dresses. However, increased need later led Dix to revise the criteria to simply a willingness to work. Dix's Army nurses were not the first to serve, but became part of an ongoing heritage of treating war casualties.
The first nurses that we would call Navy nurses were actually on a ship called the Red Rover that was considered a hospital ship during the Civil War, and they were a group of nuns that were our first Navy nurses, if you want to put it that way. We've had nurses who are actually Navy nurses, though, for 87 years.
An outbreak of typhoid fever during the Spanish-American War led to a major recruiting effort directed toward women nurses.
Unfortunately, with the Army Nurse Corps in the late 19th and early 20th century, they weren't considered military personnel. They were civilians working for the military, so they still did not have the advantages and the benefits that others serving the military did.
The service of the contract nurses in 1898 and 99 was so indispensable that it led Congress to establish the Nurse Corps as an auxiliary of the Army. Although it was a small step, creating the Nurse Corps proved to have been a wise decision by the time World War I occurred.
Now, at the beginning of World War I, it became very clear to the Secretary of the Navy, particularly, that there was going to be a severe manpower shortage for World War I. And he felt that we should not tie down able-bodied Navy sailors and Marines to desk jobs and the kinds of jobs that women were beginning to do in civilian life. Women had almost taken over the operation of offices in the civilian labor force. And he saw no reason why women should not be allowed to serve in the Navy and do those same jobs. So he asked his people, is there any reason why a yeoman has to be a man? And the response of his lawyers was no. So he said, well, let's enlist women, we'll have the best clerical workforce we could ever have, which he did.
The Navy authorized the enlistment of women in March 1917 as Yeoman F. Known as yeomanettes, over 12,000 women answered the call to serve.
I had just graduated from business college, and I had to get a job. And I walked down the street, San Francisco, and happened to see this poster of Uncle Sam, "We need you." So I thought, well, this is my day. I'll go in and see what I can find out. And that's how it all started.
Just prior to the end of World War I, extreme manpower shortages due to heavy casualties led the Marines to also enroll women as Marine Fs. The Army continued to resist, and General Pershing finally had to rely on the British Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. At the war's end, some 34,000 women had served honorably. The Secretary of War, however, was relieved that the use of women was not expanded further. On Armistice Day in 1918, all women except the nurses were demobilized. Military nurses were granted the status of officer with relative rank, but the Nurse Corps lacked full military status, functioning essentially as an auxiliary unit. The 1920s saw the rise of powerful women's organizations during the suffrage movement. And though women won the right to vote in 1920, the War Department rejected 3 different plans to integrate women into the Army between 1920 and 1939. By 1939, the conflict in Europe had intensified, and it was inevitable that the U.S. would eventually be drawn into the war. It was increasingly evident that the available manpower would not be sufficient. General Marshall predicted the extreme shortages and told Congress, "Women certainly must be employed in the overall effort of this nation. We consider it essential that their status, their relationship to the military, should be clearly established." On December 7, 1941, everything changed. With the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Marshall's predictions proved true. Though men had been drafted since September of 1940, by the summer of 42, the Army ground forces were short 160,000 men. Despite the obvious dire situation, in Congress the battle over women raged on, and the legislation to allow women to serve faced extreme opposition.
I think it is a reflection upon the courageous manhood of the country to pass a law inviting women to join the armed forces in order to win a battle.
Take the women into the armed forces, who then will do the cooking, the washing, the mending, the humble, homey tasks to which woman has always devoted herself.
Think of the humiliation. What has become of the manhood of America?
By May of 1942, after nearly 6 months of devastating warfare, Congress had no choice and passed the bill creating the WWII, Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. While General Marshall knew this was not ideal, he too had no choice but to accept auxiliary status for women. Ovida Culp-Hobby, a publisher, lawyer, and civic leader who had been instrumental in getting the WWII legislation through Congress, became the first director of the Corps. Meanwhile, the Navy, which had taken the brunt of the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, had also realized the need for employing women. The Secretary of the Navy, however, made it clear that he wanted women in the Naval Reserve rather than as an auxiliary. In July of 1942, 2.5 months after the WWII bill, the legislation was signed creating the Navy Women's Reserve. The acronym WAVES, Women Accepted for Voluntary Service, was coined and became the popular name for Navy women. The Marine Corps is under the authority of the Navy. Therefore, the same law created the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, although the Marines did not actually begin accepting women until February of 1943. In late 1942, the Coast Guard also established a women's reserve using the acronym SPAR.
Our first director was first a lieutenant commander and then was eventually promoted to captain. And she was Dorothy Stratton, who had been Dean of Purdue, Dean of Women at Purdue. And she came into the Navy and then she was one of the first group that was transferred from the Navy to the Coast Guard. And as a matter of fact, she was the one that coined the word SPAR. The Coast Guard motto is Semper Paratus, and the English translation is Always Ready. So she took the initial letter of Semper Paratus, Always Ready, and formed the word SPAR.
The Army, meanwhile, continued to recruit women into its auxiliary corps, and the initial response was very strong. Women from all walks of life volunteered. By July 1942, 400 women had entered the first officer candidate training program at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. Soon, field officers saw the advantage of having women recruits to relieve men for frontline duty.
When the women went in, the first couple of weeks, you had a bit of opposition. But after they were on the job a couple of weeks, requisitions just came pouring into headquarters for more women, and in so many different capacities from those in which they had served prior.
The initial wave of women volunteers led the Army to react overzealously, setting its recruitment goal at 1.5 million, a target which Director Hobby cautioned was unrealistic and which ultimately had disastrous effects. In fact, by the spring of '43, the Army's women's recruitment effort was severely eclipsed by its counterparts in the Navy and Coast Guard, in part due to the auxiliary status of Army women. From the beginning, it was clear the Army's auxiliary status did not work. The women were neither in nor out, so the Army's jurisdiction over the Corps was limited. Plus, the women did not have the same legal protection if they were injured overseas. Eventually, out of necessity, Congress passed a bill to establish the Women's Army Corps. President Roosevelt signed it into law July 1, 1943. 4 days later, Ovida Culp-Hobby became its director and the first woman colonel in the United States Army. Now, Colonel Hobby addressed the Corps.
This word to you is in a sense a hail and farewell. A farewell to the members of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and a hail to the members of the Women's Army Corps. You have written a fine page in the history of women at war, in this war of survival. There are other pages to write before we can say as women, mission accomplished.
Women all over the country answered the call. One of these was Mary Halloran, who would later succeed Colonel Hobby as director of the WWII.
Oh, heavens, there was no question at all. There was a need for women in the military, and there was only one answer. All the boys were going. Why not we? No, there was a job to be done. We didn't know what that job was, but the Army said there was a need, so we responded. No question.
Women in the military served in countless roles during World War II. The services determined job categories based on the appropriateness for women. Clerical, telephone operator, and instructor positions were the most widely assigned duties for women, though many filled such diverse roles as airplane mechanic and truck driver.
Starting back in 1942, we were limited in the number of jobs we could do, of course. And as the women were on the job and just extended in the various units, where need came up and the women filled the need, there was no question the requisitions began coming in for many, many jobs that women were not originally intended for. And that stretched out, of course, over the years.
The Air Force probably made the most diverse use of women, opening their job options to many technical areas. Approximately 40,000 women, nearly half of those in the Army, served in the Air WACs. Another critical role was filled by the Women's Air Service pilots, known as WASPs. The more than 1,000 WASPs were civilian employees of the Air Force. They accomplished some significant additions to the war effort.
We had done 60% of the ferrying, that's taking the aircraft from the manufacturers when they come out of the hangar, right after the factory, and delivering it to the using squadron. We did instructing. We flew aircraft so navigators could sharpen their skills. Another dangerous thing was tow target. The guys would not fly that mission because that aircraft was in bad need of maintenance. Half the stuff didn't work on it. You know, the gals who got these assignments, you know, they risked their lives. And you had raw recruits on the ground shooting with live ammunition at a target that you were towing behind your aircraft. Not comfortable. I had one friend, he missed the target and he hit the tail of her airplane. She took the bullets out and made herself a bracelet.
The Coast Guard spars similarly took over positions that freed men up for sea duty. As in the other services, at first there was some initial resistance.
One officer, he was a commander or a captain at the time, and I still remember he was on the 7th floor of Coast Guard headquarters, which is at the time was 1300 E Street in Washington. And when he was, this young lady, yeoman, was assigned to him, his words were, "Good God, first horses, then dogs, now women." But a year later, he had recommended her for OCS and the little party that they had in the office. He repeated those words, and he said, "I eat every one of those words. I never believed that a yeoman could be as efficient as this lady has been." And he said, "I get the same reports from my fellow officers because we're all so pleased with the women who are serving in the Coast Guard today."
No branch of women's services saw more frontline duty than the Army and Navy Nurse Corps. Army nurses followed closely behind combat units in nearly every theater of the war. Some 60,000 nurses served in the Army Nurse Corps, more than 200 died, 68 were taken as POWs, and 1,400 were decorated for merit and bravery under fire.
During World War II, some of the hospitals got bombed, some of the hospital ships got bombed. And so women were willing to sacrifice if they had to care for the soldiers. And the soldiers will not fight if they don't believe that somebody's going to take care of them if they're wounded.
Nevertheless, until 1944, Army nurses did not have full military status and did not receive the same pay or benefits as their male counterparts. Navy nurses were serving aboard hospital ships in Europe and the Pacific. 14,000 nurses served in the Navy during World War II. Throughout the war, the women who were serving their country faced many challenges beyond those required by their jobs. The military, quite simply, was deeply entrenched in its all-male culture. From ill-designed uniforms to questions about government issue of undergarments to dating and morality questions, the military was not prepared to integrate its new female members. Women were subjected to stringent policies regarding social conduct, marriage, and pregnancy. The press had mounted a smear campaign, often portraying women in the military as promiscuous or homosexual. Colonel Hobby and her fellow Women's Corps directors sought to deflect the image with rigid discipline. Conduct bringing discredit to the Corps was grounds for discharge. Often similar behavior for male enlisted personnel, and especially male officers, was considered only a minor infraction. Black women faced even greater challenges due to segregation. Oleta Crane, one of the first African-American female officers, served from 1942 to 1946.
They were only allowed 10 black women for every 90 white women. We were the 10%ers. Well, you know, you were so young, and coming out of college, there were a whole bunch of college women, white and black, who had probably never run into it. I'm not even sure if we knew what segregation was, except we knew you were not allowed to. It was one of those strange things. You could work together, you could march together, but they didn't like for you to eat together. I remember it got so bad that they decided that maybe they'd make everyone stand up. Nobody objected to standing side by side eating a hot dog. But if you sat down in a social atmosphere, that was just taboo.
Despite the humiliation she battled against, Lieutenant Crane remembers finding ironic humor in one situation.
We had a club they called the Charcoal Burners, and that was us sailors, both white and black, joined us because we were kind of militant coming out of college. And when the white girls would go to the Pentagon for the good assignments, they would keep their ears open to hear what was going on. What are they going to do with black officers? They'd either send us a telegram, call us up, or write us. And we hired a lawyer, and we defined the whole post, as I can remember. We'd have meetings at night, and we decided that since I didn't get in the band, they'll have a black band. And I remember the commandant called us the next day. Every day we have a meeting, he'd call us the next day and say, "I've just decided." He said, "I've just decided to have a black band." It's colored at that time. And so, of course, we recognized we had a spy, but we never found out who the Deep Throat was.
By 1943, the need was too great to overlook the resources the WWII offered. Women were needed overseas. The first enlisted women deployed to North Africa arrived in early 1943. By the end of the war, more than 20,000 women had served overseas.
Well, we were there under the bombings and so on. There was just no question about that. We had women who were injured, women who were hospitalized. But as I say, nobody ever asked for transfer. They were there to do a job, and they were ready to do a job, right on the dot. As far as combat was concerned, that was an interesting situation too, because before we shipped out for France from England, we had to wait while they were preparing, of course, for the invasion, the greatest invasion that the world had ever known. And while we were waiting, they offered the women an opportunity to be trained for sharpshooting. And it was quite interesting because the women just flocked there to the training. And interesting too, because there were a few of the women who were better shots than their trainers. But when Washington heard about it, we had a cease and desist. They said no women were going to train for anything of that kind. And it was just out of the question. We were ready. The Army wasn't.
In 1945, there were nearly 100,000 WWICs, 86,000 WAVEs, 18,000 women Marines, 57,000 Army nurses, and 11,000 Navy nurses in service to America. Altogether, 350,000 women served in the military during World War II. They were all volunteers. And while the programs in which they served were brand new when the war started, by the war's end, these women were organized, disciplined, and highly valued soldiers. By the summer of 1945, the tide of the war had turned. Hitler was defeated in April, and the Japanese surrendered in August. Celebrations abounded, but the military still had some work ahead.
There was a massive demobilization at the end of World War II. We all assumed we'd be going home. Now, some people thought, well, let's stick around as long as they need us. And then we immediately went into the occupation period. We were occupying Germany and Japan, which we hadn't really considered before. The military is really going to have to maintain a force to do that. And at that point, some of the women who were in the service said, well, I'd like to stay on and see what's going on, and I sort of like it.
There were a lot of people who wanted nothing more than to be civilians again. But there were a few, and the Navy, along with the other services, realized that not only did it need them for the short-term tasks of demobilization, which involves a lot of record keeping and a lot of financial accounting and medical examinations, so that's where they needed them. For the long term, they'd learned something in World War II, which was, if we ever need to mobilize again, we don't want to go through that long process. So let's have the legislation that permits us to have a nucleus who can serve in peacetime become careerists, and General Eisenhower and now Admiral Nimitz, who had become a great convert to the cause of women, said yes, they have. You see, the record of the waves was so wonderful, and I believe too of the other women in the Army and the other services, that the services knew how valuable they were. And so this legislation of 1948 allowed women to serve as careerists.
While many of the military top brass had realized the need for women's services, in Congress there was resistance. Colonel Mary Halloran and Navy Captain Joy Bright Hancock were instrumental in the fight for a permanent position for women.
The biggest point of opposition, as far as the men were concerned, was that someday men would have to take orders from a woman, and that they could not take. They said no. It was voted in the House, no women in the regular Army. And the bill would then have to go to conference, of course, with the Senate and the House. And there was much concern there, because the House was adamant we were not going to be in the regular Army. So anyway, we got together, and we had many men and women who had been with us in the service who were now back home. And we checked on all of those who were in the areas where the strongest opponents on the Hill were to the women in the Army. We didn't try to persuade them in any one way to, as far as their opinions are concerned, but we only contacted those we knew were favorable. So they wrote to the committee members, and they wrote to the opponents. And finally, I had a call from the advisor to the committee, and he said, call off this letter writing campaign. We don't have enough help here to answer all these letters coming in. He said, the committee has decided that there'll be certain modifications, but it'll go through for women in the regular. Well, of course, there were many modifications, but we got what we wanted. We got into the regular Army. As long as we had the first step, there was no question we'd move along on the rest.
One funny thing happened, though, at the end of World War II, when they were letting a few women stay in. One of the women was rejected because she was too old. She happened to be the foremost woman computer scientist in the world, Grace Hopper, and 15 years later, they humbly asked her to come back and eventually made her an admiral. And she served on active duty to an older age than anyone else in modern time.
On June 12, 1948, President Truman signed the Women's Armed Services Act into law, finally establishing a permanent place for women in their nation's Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. Through the process of compromise, the Integration Act contained many provisions that the women leaders objected to. Some would take over 20 years or more to get changed. While giving permanent status to women in their own corps, the Integration Act prohibited women from combat-related positions, limited each service to one line colonel or Navy captain, prohibited women from being considered for general officer or admiral, imposed a 2% ceiling on the proportion of women on duty in each branch of services, and authorized a blanket authority by the service secretaries to discharge any woman while no such authority existed for men. The law's provisions for dependents were particularly unsettling and were based on deeply entrenched stereotypes that married women and women with children had no place in the military, and that men would always be the primary supporter of families. These discriminatory regulations eventually proved problematic for the services, but it took many years to change them. Despite these points of difference, the women's services felt they'd won a victory. Thus began the long process of truly integrating themselves into the military. It was left to a small number of pioneers.
And here again, we're talking in very small numbers of women. Very, very small. There weren't more than 4,000 total when the Integration Act passed, with the exception of the nurses. I'm talking in terms of the WWII, the Waves, the Air Force women, and the Marines. The Coast Guard abolished their women's group entirely. There were very few women who came into the regular services when it was offered. Very few. And then there were some reserves called for the Korean War. And then a large effort was made to recruit women again, for the Korean War, it was a failure, a total failure. They were unable to recruit women for the Korean War without enormous expense and enormous effort. The reason being that they were drafting men. And women were saying, well, if they need me, they'll draft me.
In the 50s, the main thing they did was they hung out. They hung on. They stayed in the military and kept their toe in the door, but they didn't want to make waves. There was still a group that thought women don't really belong in the peacetime military. So the gals in the 50s were just quietly making a career for themselves, not making waves, and staying in.
They had a beachhead, and the issue was how to judiciously expand it, and realized there was a lot that they had to learn as a group. How do you go from one duty station to another? How do you form a network within the service? How do you learn to forward your own career, take responsibility for it? These were things that the men knew, and they had to learn that. So there was a period of 20, 30 years where all the individuals knew their jobs and did them very well, but they were learning to operate within this culture.
I joined the Marine Corps in 1954 and served until I retired in 1990. I joined the Marine Corps as an enlisted Marine, a private, and retired as a Brigadier General. The Korean conflict was certainly going on at that time, but there were only a couple thousand women Marines at that time, and most people did not even know they existed. The majority, when I told people that I was going to join the Marines, they said, well, you can't because there aren't any women in the Marine Corps. I imagine a lot of people thought I was crazy. I know my brother disowned me. He told people that I'd passed away.
Throughout the late 50s and early 60s, women soldiers became essentially clerks in uniform. Though Presidents Kennedy and Johnson encouraged the utilization of woman power, ranks in the women's program shrank to 30,660 in all of the armed forces by 1965.
I think at that time, I have to admit, that was a day-to-day survival situation. Again, it wasn't until much later that I began thinking with a broader view of women's roles and so on and so forth. At that time, it was just Gail Reels trying to make it from day to day and week to week and month to month, and doing what was expected, and whether I was going to make private first class or corporal or sergeant, etc., and do the work.
By the mid-60s, the war in Vietnam was escalating rapidly. Despite the war's unpopularity with the American public, many men and women volunteered to serve. Military women felt a patriotic duty to do their part, and many asked specifically to be sent to Southeast Asia.
In 1964, when I joined the Navy, the Vietnam War was just becoming a reality, and I did specifically request to go to Vietnam. At the time, the Navy had all of its nurses that were going to be assigned in theater to go in only their second tour, so that for the first 2 years they had to serve stateside. That was a requirement that after all these years we realized was a very wise policy at the time, because we were not only equipped professionally, but then we were equipped emotionally, and we knew as much as anyone can know going into a combat arena, perhaps what to expect. We knew who we were as nurses, we knew what our organization was about, we knew our team players, fellow players, and it was a wise decision.
I think we served a dual role. We did our jobs, and we did them very, very well, which allowed the Army to have more men in combat, which was the purpose of the women in the Army in the first place, was to replace men who could go to combat. The second was an American woman in Vietnam represented mother, sister, daughter, fiance, girlfriend, because they were able to. I had men stop me on the street and say, just talk to me, just talk to me. I haven't seen an American woman. And so I think our role was to do our job, do it well, we did that, and also represent the American woman in a combat zone.
The majority of women who served in Vietnam were medical personnel. Many of them were involved in combat action, many were injured, and some lost their lives.
See, in Vietnam, you didn't move with the troops. That was a different kind of war. There weren't any set battle lines. You were almost at risk wherever you were, and a lot of our hospitals were sitting right on the flight line, so if somebody lopped the motor in, you know, you were at risk.
My proudest moment was the day I was awarded a Bronze Star, and you only get that in combat.
Many women who served in Vietnam were deeply affected by the war, and like male veterans of this conflict, suffered from psychological wounds for years to come. Public perception has hardly taken notice of the fact that women were also in Vietnam. The women's movement that was gaining momentum back home had not yet discovered the battle their sisters in uniform had been fighting for the right to serve their country. Political divisiveness led military women to distrust their civilian counterparts. Many military women felt that they had already made great strides toward equality, while others recognized there were many issues within the military that needed attention.
A lot of women in the military, I know, kind of look down their noses at the women libbers and thought that they were a disgrace, bought into a lot of the early ridicule of, I think, of the... I must say that I was probably in that group for a while, but then I began to realize that that what they were doing was going to have an impact on us. There was just no, and I began to see that the military was very concerned about the ERA passing, for instance, that it was obviously going to do all the terrible things that Phyllis Schlafly kept saying it was going to do, and they were afraid of all kinds of things, and it would immediately overrule the combat restriction and so on and so forth. And so there's no question in my mind that the convergence of the all-volunteer force with more women in the military, plus what was happening in society, pushed. I don't believe the military was only moving at the speed that they felt they had to move. They were not out in front. They were out in front on some other issues in racial integration and a lot of other things, but as far as women, that was not going to be something that they were going to be out in front on. And the women's movement played a big part in that, a big part.
Directives issued within the military during the 70s codified many of the restrictions under which women had lived in civilian life during the 50s. Simple aspects, such as uniforms and appearance, typified attitudes toward women at that time. Women were no longer allowed to appear in fatigues or boots as they had been during World War II. Now, under the guise of maintaining a feminine appearance, military women were required to wear high-heeled pumps and certain colors of lipstick and nail polish. As Ovida Kalpabi had predicted, there were many pages to write before women could claim full status in the services. On a case-by-case basis, courageous women moved the military leaders forward and fought their quiet battles for equal treatment.
As a single person, you know, you don't always get the same deal as the men. And when I went to Korea as a chief nurse, the commander and the XO and the chief of professional services had a house. They were family men. But I was, as chief nurse, nursing is the biggest department in a hospital. And my responsibilities expanded wherever we had medical units in Korea to look at the quality of care in health clinics and so forth. And I was forced to live in a BOQ. And I had found that married men on post who were getting separation allowance from their families had a house. And I thought that was very discriminatory. So I told the chief of the corps when I went over there that I was going to get a house for the chief nurse, because we had had one and then a married nurse came in and then we lost it, so you know, was always refinding it. So I started at the bottom and I worked up, and people told me, oh, you're going to ruin your career doing this, and I said, well, you know, I wasn't afraid, because I was, you know, had quite a bit of time in the Army at that time, and I was just going to fight it. And the first house they offered me was a condemned house. And so I refused that one and persevered, and pretty soon they came across with one for me, and my nurses were just watching to see what was going to happen. And I mean, it was just wonderful. I had a big party when I moved in, and I think it was good for them to see that you can fight policies and you don't get your career ruined. And you know, and you have to work within the system. You can't, I don't believe in working outside the system. I think you have to work within the system to get things accomplished and have your facts now.
Eventually, the military could not hold out to the rising force of women's expanding role in society. The effects of the war in Vietnam, coupled with the conflict over the selective service in the late 60s, led to the first expansion of women's programs since Korea. It was in 1967 that Lyndon Johnson changed the course of the women's military by signing into law mandates to remove restrictions on the careers of female officers. 2 years later, the first women generals were appointed.
I always tell everybody I was in the right time, right place at the right time, because when we were eligible to become a general officer, I was the director WWII, and if the system was that because I was the director WWII, I should get the first star in my corps. And at the same time, Anna Mae Hayes was the chief of the Army Nurse Corps, and we were selected and promoted together. And the first, as General Westmoreland says, the first generals in the Western world since Joan of Arc.
The regulations created in the 1948 Integration Act regarding dependents and the policy toward women being married became significant issues as the military looked to women as a major part of its move to an all-volunteer force. They could not maintain these strict regulations and hoped to recruit the number of women required.
Whenever there was a manpower shortage, there was a need to turn to, if you will, woman power. None more so than during the period when the United States decided to end the post-war draft. And when the decision was made to end the draft in 1972 by Richard Nixon and to go to an all-volunteer force, but still maintain a large Department of Defense, it was very clear at that point that they could not achieve that goal without heavy reliance on women. And that was the major factor that resulted in the rapid expansion of the numbers of women in the armed forces and in the jobs made available to them. There was a major revolution, you might say, that went on in the 70s and continued on into the 80s, where women became integrated for the first time, really integrated into the U.S. Armed Forces.
If we look back to the history of the Navy in 1972, 1% of the population of the enlisted were women, and 4% of the officer population were women. Now we have 16% of the reserve officers are women, and 19.5% of the reserve enlisted are women. So we can see the differences that have taken place. And women are serving in jobs that you'd never think about. They're quartermasters and electricians' mate, and they're doing construction battalion duties. They're in all of the aircraft and aircraft maintenance squadrons. They have weapons station, ships afloat. We still have limitations on combat ground forces, but there is an unlimited opportunity for women in the military, and it's only going to increase as time goes on.
I like to point out to people that what we see generally in the military does reflect what's happening in our culture in the United States, essentially. I think in some ways we're steps ahead, actually, but it's reflective upon where we're going nationally. We, for instance, at one time, most of our nurses were not married. When you got married, and I remember this when I came in, really, when you got married, you got out. And if you got pregnant, you certainly got out, because you were not allowed to stay on active duty or in the reserves if you were pregnant and you had a dependent. Well, that changed as more and more women nationally had to go to work or went to work or were interested in working. And the numbers of nurses in the services increased in terms of those who were married. In fact, today, just about 50% of our nurses on active duty are married.
Women were allowed to get out if they were married. They were not forced out, but they were allowed to get out if they were married, and they were encouraged to get out when they married. Now, if they had children, they were forced to get out. But came the all-volunteer force, they could not stand the losses that generated. Also, they were being taken to court by women who challenged them for the first time for discharges, for pregnancy, for minor children, and won in court, were winning in court. And so that forced the services to change their policies. But also, for the pragmatic reason that those policies are generating enormous losses, they decided they could not tolerate that as well. And with the change of those policies, for the first time in our history, we've had women who are leading normal family lives as well as doing a military job. That was never possible until the 70s.
In 1977, the Brookings Institute published a report entitled Women and the Military, which suggested that 33% of the jobs in the military could be filled by women, and that greater utilization of women would result in a higher caliber all-volunteer force.
That, of course, was the first time that anyone had attempted to pull together the role of women in the military, historically and contemporarily, and the possibilities for the expanded use of women. It's important to realize that in 1976, the draft was in deep trouble. And although the services were recruiting more women, the military was not willing to accept the fact that they were not going to get the draft back, and that they would have to be recruiting more women, but they were reluctant to admit this. And it was the Brookings Institute study that laid out the possibilities for the employment of women on a much larger scale than any of the services had contemplated, that got the attention of the Department of Defense. And then they did their own studies and discovered that the Brookings Institute study was correct.
As the services changed, more women sought command positions. In the Coast Guard, women were already commanding ships afloat.
I don't think I had any more problems at my units than my male counterparts had. The problems that you have are personnel problems that everybody deals with, and everybody has different ways of handling it, so that I didn't really see being any different. I know my crew probably had it a little bit different, because when they would go off to school, the Coast Guard being so small, they would always get, oh, you're at that unit with that woman in charge. What's it like working for a woman? You know, you're the one that has that female bosun mate there. What's it like working for that female bosun mate? And fortunately, my guys would say, I don't see it any different. She's a chief.
When I joined the Marine Corps in 1954, there were probably only 4 occupational fields women could go into. When I went back to Parris Island in the 80s, there were only 4 they couldn't go in.
As technology and the nature of war changes, the inclusion of women as full participating members of a combat force has become a serious issue.
Today we have very high-tech warfare, and you really don't have a front line anymore. For instance, in Saudi Arabia, you know, I had the experience of many Scud attacks, and any of those could have wiped us out. So, and when it happened, there were more people killed behind the lines than that were up on front with that one Scud attack. So it's really hard to say, is there a real difference anymore? And I think it doesn't matter if you're on the front, you're on the back, or where you happen to be. Just because of the nature of warfare now, it's very difficult to say that you'll never be in combat.
We flew one mission where we actually went into Iraq, which I kind of would joke about it because there wasn't that many female pilots over there that got to fly the missions into Iraq refueling. But we would joke about it because at that time women weren't allowed into combat, and if flying into Iraq wasn't going into combat, then I don't know what that is. I was part of a crew, and they just sent the crew. They couldn't say, you can't go because you're a female, so we're going to send another pilot in your spot. So I got sent over there, and I wanted to go, and it was quite an experience, and it was what we trained for. I flew those missions every day, refueling fighters at Grissom, and there was no reason why I shouldn't have gone. I was fully qualified to do the mission.
But old perceptions die hard, and in today's military, women still face misconceptions about what they do and who they are.
when I went back to high school, back to my high school, I think it was after my sophomore year, or I've been back there quite a few times, and some of the girls, younger girls, and even my teachers will come up to me and they're like, "You still look like a woman." And they're totally surprised. They thought that coming here and being around all these men that I'd turn into some big brute, on steroids or something. I don't know what they thought, but they thought I'd lose all my femininity and I wouldn't, appear as a woman, as feminine as I was before. And that's the biggest surprise that a lot of people come up to me and comment on. They're like, "You're in the military? No, you don't look like you shouldn't be in the military. You don't look like you should be." And it's just a perception. A lot of people don't understand or don't know, I guess. There's quite a few women in the military that still look like women.
Last year I was selected the job of squadron commander for 24th Squadron, and the first thing that happened was, "Oh, she got it because she was a woman." And I heard that for a couple weeks. It was just, "She's a woman, the blank got it because she's a woman." And it really makes you question yourself, say, maybe I did get it just because I'm a woman, and you start saying, I'm not worthy and I can't do it. But like so many other things, you have to say, no, I can do it, and look into yourself and find that faith and find that assurance that you got the job for a reason and you have to be able to accomplish it. That was the hardest thing I've ever had to deal with here. And it really makes you think that you are a minority and you have to stand up for yourself, and it's very difficult sometimes, very difficult.
I'll tell you, many of the congressmen who opposed us back when the legislation was pending would have apoplexy if they saw the women today and the jobs that they hold and the rank that they hold and where they serve. And of course, one day we're going into combat. There's no question at all about that. Now, if you have to draft men in order to fill the Army, in time of war, there's going to have to be a draft of women too. All of these things are just going to have to change, and will.
As the numbers of women in the military grows and the numbers of jobs that they fill continues to expand, these proud young women are determined to prove themselves. And like their foremothers dating back to Molly Pitcher, they are willing to do what it takes to serve their country.
Women have made it through pilot training. Women have flown high-performance T-38s. When we graduate from pilot training, we've had the exact same training as the men. Nothing has been changed for us. And we made it through the same training they did. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to go on to fly any aircraft we want.
I think that a positive move would be for people just to not consider it as big an issue as they do. I think that, and I can already see it in the younger generation versus the older generation, the sheer numbers of, women going through the academy or women flying airplanes in our age group isn't nearly as much of a factor. I've had lots of men, even men my age in my career field, say, "You were the first woman to fly C-130s? Really?" Like they can't believe that it wasn't allowed. And then you'll have the older men going, "Wow, God, everything's changing, I would just like it to always be like that, Well, it's about time they let you do this, or it's about time they let you do that, or just assume that it's okay. And just accept that, if their co-pilot happens to be a woman or if their aircraft commander happens to be a woman, that it's no factor. It's just another pilot. I mean, we don't have to be one of the boys in order to be one of the pilots.
It's hard for me to say that a man's life is worth less and can be sacrificed easier than a woman's life. And we have such an incredibly intense culture in the United States when it comes to woman versus man and what is their true role, that it's really hard to say that they don't belong in combat or men belong in combat. And it's hard for me in my generation to step back and say, well, I can have all the benefits and I can go out and serve and I can wear medals and I can have dog tags around my neck and I can have veterans benefits and walk in parades, but I'm not going to be called upon to make that ultimate sacrifice. And in my conscience, I can't do that. If I'm willing to reap all the benefits, if I'm willing to say I love my country and I want to serve, that means I'm willing to step out on the line and do whatever it takes.
People almost seem like we're so eager to throw our lives away, like, oh, please let me fight in combat so I can die, and I think people need to realize that everybody is afraid of dying, and that's inherent in everybody, but a lot of us feel that we know we can do the job, and that we know that we can serve our country, and the whole prospect of being killed in combat is very scary to a woman. It's just as frightening as it is to a man, and it's not like we have something to prove. It's just that, like I said before, the best person for a job should always get it, and they shouldn't get it because of their gender, and they shouldn't be denied it because of their gender. but the intention behind it is that we feel that we can do the job right, and we feel that the country is being disserviced when we're not allowed to get that chance.
I think that we have a tendency to think that national defense is a male responsibility, a male citizen's responsibility. I think we have a tendency to forget that women are citizens as well, and that they have just as much of a right and an obligation and a responsibility to understand national defense issues and to participate in national defense in whatever way they think is appropriate for them in crisis. I think we have to stop looking at men as the citizens who serve their country, start looking at men and women as citizens who can serve their country.
When the desert sands settled after the Persian Gulf War, the United States Armed Services counted 13 women among its honored dead. Women have proved themselves in every aspect of service and valor, in every war our country has fought. Their courage in Desert Storm only served to make Americans more aware of these women's sacrifices. After Desert Storm, Congress introduced an amendment to remove bans on women flying combat missions. Of course, the old rhetoric surfaced once again, attempting to limit women's role in the military, but this time equality won out. On December 5, 1991, the 1948 law restricting women from flying combat missions was repealed. Other changes are occurring on an almost weekly basis in today's military. While the last words of Ovida Kolpabi's prediction remain unwritten, the ball is in motion. Soon all of our country's bravest and brightest that choose to join the armed forces will be allowed to serve in the jobs for which they are capable. Every citizen of this country should be proud to know that in the battles to protect our ideals and honored traditions, women are in service to America.